Hello, and welcome everyone back to the Heterodox History Podcast. Today I'm going to be reviewing a 2014 BBC mini-series called The 37 Days concerning the so-called July Crisis, the countdown to Britain's declaration of war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914, most notably starring Ian McDiarmid as Edward Grey. Now, this is an interesting one. I wasn't planning on doing a review of this series for some myriad reasons, but having discussed the 1970s series about the demise of the Hohenzollern, Habsburg, and Romanov dynasties, the fall of eagles, the issue when reviewing that series was that it seemed to omit the July Crisis entirely. They set up the July Crisis with an episode called The Dress Rehearsal, revolving around the Bosnian crisis, and many of the characters which are featured, such as Earl Grey, prominently enough. And that episode ends rather ominously with Edward Grey rather than Earl Grey. I'm probably going to confuse those two during the stream, so bear with me. I do mean Sir Edward Grey and not Earl Grey. Um, the ending of that episode, the dress rehearsal, ends with Edward Grey stating to, or rather Edward VII stating to Edward Grey rather ominously concerning the alliance structure that's been formed, the Triple Entente, Russia, France, and Britain. Edward VII talks to Edward Grey and says, "Have you not drawn the battle lines of Europe?" And Edward Grey responds rather sort of gormlessly, saying, "Oh, surely not, sir." And you could almost say that this is the unwritten sequel to that concerning the Fall of Eagles series. It is a 3-hour epic concerning mainly the British antics around the declaration of war and the increasing crisis, especially from 24th of July onwards up until the 4th of August of 1914. So as an addendum to that, that is my primary motivation for looking at this series, but also the novelty. This was produced with the centenary of the First World War, the beginning of the First World War. And seldom do you see any program like this, especially one looking at it from a continental perspective, albeit, as I'm going to go into, a very limited continental perspective. The writer and producer of this program is a man called Mark Hayhurst. And I looked back into his history, and he seems to be a rather standard BBC history documentary writer. And his primary motivation, he went around and did research on this topic, apparently compiling a colossal amount of primary sources concerning the correspondence, the diplomatic correspondence revolving around these crucial 37 days. And his mission was to shatter the myth of the inevitability of World War One, which is an endeavor which I very much sympathize with and believe should be a matter of course correction for all World War One historians and indeed all school subjects teaching this matter, all history concerning this, because the history concerning this is often horrifically simplified and, in my view, counterproductive and damaging. So the endeavor of trying to shatter the inevitability, the myth of the inevitability of World War One is wonderful. Yet at the same time, Mark Hayhurst also falls into many of the tropes surrounding the various nations and powers of World War One. So in some senses, it gets a serious amount of respect from me, but at the same time, it provokes my ire rather considerably. And I'll get into what I mean exactly. We start off, actually, I think before I get into the actual details revolving around the series, I'll introduce the context surrounding the 37 days first, because maybe again, to the series' credit, the series doesn't go back and explain the 10 or 20 or so years leading up to the assassination of the heir to the Austrian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Again, I would actually consider that a merit to this series. You're not brought into the July crisis with a huge amount of preconceptions and baggage, which is often what all chroniclers of the build up to World War One do. They tend to focus on the arms build-up, in particular the naval race between Britain and Germany, which is only mentioned mainly by Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, rather tangentially in this series. Um, it's also important to understand the alliance structure and how you can say that this is actually one of the strengths of this little mini series in terms of unpacking and understanding what this alliance structure is. Because, of course, the oversimplified version of history is that when Austria decided to attack Serbia, it initiated or activated a series of alliances which made World War I inevitable. And again, that is something which I want to praise about this series, is that the series really tries to deconstruct that and get into the details concerning the various stakes involved for all the various powers. But just to quickly go over this, in 1894, Republican France allies with Tsarist Russia. The explanations in the series are rather thin, but in summary, this, from the French point of view, was very much to deal with German expansionism. From Russia, this was more reacting to Germany's lack of desire to renew the reinsurance treaty. Before this, Russia and Germany had been allies. And from the Russian point of view, there was also an interest in using the French colonial empire to put pressure on the British. And this is the height of the British Empire under Lord Salisbury. And it's important to understand that this isn't simply a Germanophobic alliance, especially from the Russian point of view. There is also an element of anti-British sentiment here, which is very important to understand in terms of how we find this diplomatic about turn with the Triple Entente and with Britain going to war alongside France and Russia in 1914. The Germans, of course, had formed an alliance with Austria-Hungary. They had defeated Austria in 1866 in order to unify Germany, the Prussians. And later on, Bismarck understood the strategic necessity of having the Austrians on side, to put it very simply. In 1900, this alliance was joined to Italy, which becomes the Triple Alliance. So the dual alliance of Russia and France and the triple alliance of Germany, Austria, and Italy. As it concerns with Austria, Austria is having an ongoing issue with the so-called nationality conflicts. Austria-Hungary is not simply a matter of the Austrian Germans and the Hungarians. Austria is a large melting pot, is the largest state in continental Europe. The only state in Europe which is larger than Austria-Hungary is Russia, but it is in no way ethnically homogeneous. It is very much a heterogeneous empire. We have Czechs against Germans, Poles against Ruthenians, Ukrainians, Transylvanian Romanians against the Hungarians, Slovaks, Italians, Slovenes, Croatians, Serbians, Bosniaks, etc. And so this all comes to a head in the 1908 Bosnian crisis, when Bosnia, which had been a part of the Turkish Empire and was occupied by Austrian troops since 1878, was formally annexed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia, having made a secret agreement with Austria, then pulls back from it and tries to essentially promote the idea of Serb irredentism, Pan-Slavism, the idea that all Slavic speakers should be joined together. In this case, there are a considerable number of Serbs within the Austrian Empire that ideally, according to this Pan-Slavic idea, should be joined together with Serbia, and thereby the Austrian annexation of an area with a considerable amount of Serbs would provoke the ire of the Russian Empire. Of course, this doesn't go very well. The Germans stand by the Austrians, and the Russians principally back down. As concerned with the German issue, especially German relations with France and Britain, the events which many historians bring up again and again, the Moroccan crisis and the Agadir crisis. I'm only going to mention the Agadir crisis very tangentially, as it concerns one of the characters brought up in this mini-series, which is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George. So we have various antagonisms in Europe at the moment. We have a military arms race, a army arms race, as well as a naval arms race. And it's important to understand, at least from my point of view, that there is no inevitability of the situation of a general conflagration in Europe, a general European war. One of the great diplomatic successes of this concert of Europe, the alliance system of the various great powers, was that no general European war had been fought between 1815 and 1914, making the 19th century a virtual European golden age, in which they were able to project power outwards as opposed to using all their energies to destroy each other. The major exceptions to this, of course, in the Balkans, the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, the wars of Italian unification, and more importantly for this discussion, the wars of German unification, which humbled France and dispossessed France of the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. So when we open up on the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, 28th of June 1914, it is at the end of this long European summer, this era of relative peace and prosperity. And again, to give credit to this series, the fact they don't lean too much on this idea of historical inevitability by drudging up all these events as if they were direct precursors. This is something that I believe Fall of Eagles suffers from, because Fall of Eagles is fundamentally a drama involving historical personages. And as a result, they have to present the demise and fall of the various dynasties in some sense of historic inevitability. Whereas what this series does is does the opposite of that and show how even in the last few days before Britain's entry into war in response nominally to the invasion of Belgium by Germany, that everything was up for play. So coming to the series, we are introduced to a Scottish Foreign Office clerk. He's credited as Alec, a fictional character who acts as narrator for the audience and perhaps a somewhat relatable fish out of water character. That's what I'm to assume, because of course he is fictional. And he introduces us to the Palace of Whitehall. Rather confusingly for me, it's very obviously not the Palace of Whitehall. The building is actually the Belfast City Hall. And the entire series here is shot in Belfast for some reason. Maybe it was cheap to shoot there. I would have, of course, loved some historic locations, but of course, that's rather difficult to achieve in Germany, especially with the old Reichschancellery. So I can understand, especially for budget limitations, why they would decide to do that. There's the fact they emphasize so much on the architecture of the building and they keep going back to it again and again and again. Anyone with knowledge of London, and of course the audience is going to be primarily British, this is the British Broadcasting Corporation, is going to be rather confused seeing this, but ignoring a little nitpick like that. Alec introduces us to the vast amounts of information which are circling around the Foreign Office, as to emphasize the fact that the London and by extension the Foreign Service there is at the center of the world as a consequence of the fact that the British Empire spans the entire world and has interests everywhere. He goes on to explain that the Foreign Office receives 6,000 telegrams a day, millions of telegrams over the year. And this is all to establish how, in the grand scheme of things, in terms of Britain's myriad interests, and he explains this with a coup in Argentina, the abolition of slavery in Siam, that the Sarajevo assassination, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is rather insignificant, especially from the British perspective. And in terms of the series, I think that's quite an effective way of demonstrating how seemingly insignificant the catalyst for the July crisis was. And this is a sentiment which Alec himself reinforces. And just to emphasize in terms of historical relatability, Alec is not alone. He, albeit as a fictional character, but in terms of acting as the vehicle into this world, into this historic period, his views were very much shared by the then Liberal Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Herbert Asquith. However, he goes to Undersecretary Eyre Crowe, and he contends that this isn't interesting enough to show him to bother the Foreign Secretary with. And Eyre Crowe disagrees, and we go off and we're introduced to both Eyre Crowe and to Edward Grey. Now, my issue with having a figure like Alec is that he is far from a neutral observer, and he becomes a mouthpiece for the documentary writers. And so the prejudices of, in particular, Mark Hayhurst become his prejudices, as we shall see. And this is where the series ultimately, I would say in some respects, completely fails. So we're introduced to Edward Grey as Ian McDermott in conversation with Nicholas Farrell as Crowe, discussing the complications that may arise should the Archduke's assassin be a Serb. It's also important to note in terms of introducing who Eyre Crowe is. Eyre Crowe is sort of notorious in terms of understanding this period because he's one of the most consistent anti-German voices at the Foreign Office. As a clerk, he had promoted a memorandum on the present state of British relations with France and Germany for the Foreign Office. And this is very much where you later get the, I would argue, the myth of German war guilt, the idea that Germany under the Kaiser is wanting to establish a European hegemony and then, as a consequence of the Kaiser's Weltpolitik, establish Germany as a world power. And consequently, Germany was a threat to the balance of power and by extension, the peace of Europe, and should be compared with Napoleon, say. He also believes that any sort of détente or treaty with Germany is by way and a means of appeasement, which would very much be echoed with later sort of hindsight sentiments regarding Adolf Hitler. And essentially, he viewed that Germany's position in foreign affairs was that of the perennial blackmailer. Now, why I find this rather frustrating is, first of all, I believe this is actually rather underplayed, interestingly enough, in the series, Crowe's antipathy towards Germany. There is a sentiment by Edward Grey that, as half German himself, as someone who was educated and born in Germany, he was holding the Germans to a impossible moral standard. But as we are introduced to the workings of the Foreign Office, it very much appears that the Foreign Office is a three-man team between Alec, Eyre Crowe, and Sir Edward Grey. And of course, this is complete nonsense. Eyre Crowe was not the permanent secretary to the Foreign Office, Sir Arthur Nicholson was. And of course, we have other figures such as William Tyrrell, Grey's personal secretary. Now, the reason I bring up these characters is that this is a way to find some sort of counterweight to Eyre Crowe's Germanophobia. And to bring up Tyrrell in particular, again, tried to confuse this whole picture of the alliance structure, whereas Crowe is advocating for effectively isolation for Germany, not giving in to quote unquote appeasement. Tyrrell was supposedly going to go on a mission to Germany in 1914 to work out some form of arrangement that could potentially have rivaled that of the Entente Cordiale and the Triple Entente. Essentially, it would have represented the culmination of this policy of trying to ease tensions, with the final one being Germany. And I find that relatively fascinating in terms of Grey trying to juggle all of these potential powers at the same time. And Tyrrell is essential in terms of understanding that, and perhaps a part of the series could have acted as an interesting counterbalance. Instead, the counterbalance does not come from the British Foreign Office, which is presented as rather myopic in the state, but instead it's presented by the German ambassador to London, Prince Lichnowsky. So moving on from the introduction of Edward Grey and Earl Crowe, we talk about the Archduke's assassination and the potential political ramifications that may come of that. Also, in order to elicit various sympathy for Ian McDermott's character of Sir Edward Grey, Alec informs us that Grey is the victim of multiple family tragedies. The fact that one of his brothers was killed, I believe, by a lion, his wife was thrown from a horse. And this isn't historically sort of contingent because this happened 14 years after this, but one of his brothers was indeed killed by a buffalo. Grey is next shown at a Downing Street supper with Asquith, Herbert Asquith, played by Tim Pigott-Smith, Margot Asquith, obviously Asquith's wife, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, though I'm sure for people who have no familiarity with this history, it could be rather jarring seeing Winston Churchill as being part of the triumvirate calling for war in 1914, and later also wartime prime minister during the Second World War. In this case, Winston Churchill is played by Nicholas Asbury. And of course, we are also introduced to David Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard, and the so-called People's Champion, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I find this conversation rather interesting because Margot effectively brings up the issue in Ireland revolving the brewing civil war and Parliament's opposition to the Ulster militia. Now, this isn't fleshed out enough for my satisfaction, but Margot is effectively as some sort of historical mouthpiece, brings up enough information to invest the audience into what were ultimately the main political concerns of the British class at that time, something that had been brewing since 1912 with the passage of the third attempted passage of the third Home Rule Act for Ireland. Effectively, you have people trying to smuggle in weapons to the Covenanters, the Ulster Covenanters, the Ulster militia, backed by Sir Edward Carson, who are trying to resist the idea that the Northern Irish, the Ulstermen, should become part of a Irish-dominated devolved administration, Irish Home Rule. And this isn't explained really to much satisfaction. And there's even a line where Margot brings up the fact that Asquith should use the army to crush the Ulster militia. And the fascinating thing about this line, also, I think displaying Margot's stupidity during the situation, is that the loyalty of the army is seriously put under strain with the issue of Home Rule, because so many officers in the British Army come from a Anglo-Irish heritage. And as a result of that, a Protestant Anglo-Irish heritage, they are invested in the idea of Ireland retaining its place within the United Kingdom, not as a devolved administration, believing also that any Irish Home Rule will effectively mean Catholic domination in Ireland. So there is a significant issue regarding the loyalty of the army, and this has a major consequence because the director of military operations for the British Empire at that time, Henry Wilson, essentially viewed that Britain could do two things. Britain could use the Home Army to invade Ireland, to impose Home Rule by force, as per the desire of the then Liberal government, which had been supported by votes of the Irish Home Rule Party and Labour, or it could be involved in a continental expedition. It couldn't do both. So there is this lingering idea, which isn't really built upon here, but it brings it up, that a continental war could potentially act as some form of imperfect solution to the Irish issue. But as the series so far is concerned, we're bringing up the Irish issue as the thing which is dominating British politics and the precarious domestic situation that Britain finds itself in with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Alec then introduces us to Gavrilo Princip and his quote-unquote friends' desire for Serb irredentism, the idea that Bosnia and Herzegovina should be joined to the Kingdom of Serbia, if necessary, through violence. And of course, he refers to Franz Ferdinand, and this is where we really get into the negative tropes that the writing suffers from, and where I'm almost willing to take off all of the points which I gave it in praise regarding challenging the myth of inevitability, because he refers to Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg throne, and the symbol of everything that Princip hated about Austrian rule. Its arrogance, bullying, and the sheer fact it regarded the Serbs in the province as an inferior race. Now, what I find rather frustrating about this, yes, it is true that Franz Ferdinand was irascible. That's beyond contention. However, they also show him coming out of the Sarajevo City Hall. And what I find hysterical about this is that at that particular time, he had every reason to be irascible because he just survived a bomb being thrown at his carriage by a member of the Black Hand. And he berates the member of the local Sarajevo government who had been there to address him on his visit on the 28th of June. As for this idea of regards the Serbs in the province as an inferior race, that is an incredibly fraught position to take, involving the complex nature of ethnic relations in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have effectively three divisions within Austro-Hungary at this point. Cisleithania, which represents the non-Hungarian territories, the crown of St. Stephen, which represents Hungary and part of Croatia. And then we see Bosnia and Herzegovina itself, which is part of neither, but is a co-dominion of Austria and Hungary. And so by extension, the Habsburgs are playing a very careful balancing act between the Bosniak Muslims, the Croatians, and the Serbians. So to say something like regards the Serbs and the province as an inferior race is a incredibly, you can say, I wouldn't say disingenuous, but I would say it's overly simplistic, and it doesn't allow the viewer to understand the nature of the ethnic situation within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, other than the fact that the reader might understand that the Austrians are German speakers and ethnically German, and thereby, by extension, we're talking about German oppression within the Austrian Empire, which is even more ridiculous when you consider that perhaps in terms of all the ethnic groups, the Hungarians were the most powerful. It's also interesting to note that we talk about the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, which is brought up, which is several times mentioned as the day of Holy Morning, the holy day. And I sort of wonder if the writer was terrified of using the Kosovo example to bring up recent memories about the NATO intervention and, of course, Slobodan Milosevic, as if to elicit more sympathy for the Serbs. But I couldn't help noticing this. And of course, Alec goes on to say that the assassins had lost their nerve. No, they had tried, and one of them had already tried to blow up. And it is by sheer fluke that the Princip effectively finds himself with Sophie Chotek and with Franz Ferdinand in a back alley, which gives him the opportunity to murder them both. We are then introduced to Alec's fictional counterpart at the German Imperial Chancellery, Jens, credited as, and he introduces himself to the audience via his political inclinations, that he is a liberal, and by extension, liberalism is understood to be a kind of poison, and that he is a Democrat, and he is a German nationalist, and thereby, by extension, he is anti-Prussian. Now, this is to try and place him at odds with the so-called Junker ruling elite and the military hierarchy in Prussia at that time. And so he will constantly refer to both the German Prussian elite and the Austrians with a little bit of disdain. Again, I wonder if, again, this is to make the German equivalent to Alec slightly more relatable to a modern audience, yet at the same time, it doesn't really go anywhere. I believe that this effectively peters out, and it has as with the Alec plot doesn't go anywhere. You set up something quite significant involving the potential complications of having, you can say, heretical notions while working for Beckman Holvig, yet you don't expound upon this, you don't develop them. But nevertheless, moving onwards. So we are brought into the Kaiser's remit, the Kaiser's world. We're introduced to Kaiser Wilhelm II, and we are brought up with this idea of the personal relationship of Kaiser Wilhelm II and Franz Ferdinand. There was a mention of them being hunting partners, decimating the woodland population of Bohemia. And again, this is to try and color the perception of German foreign policy, that as Germany is still fundamentally a monarchical state, unlike Britain, which has moved towards a more parliamentary form of government, thereby German policy is directed by imperial fiat, imperial whim, and by extension, the personal relationships of the Kaiser himself. Now, it is undeniably true that the Kaiser's view on Franz Ferdinand did color his relationship, especially towards Austria and Franz Ferdinand. But of course, he was also united to Franz Ferdinand by this shared belief in the indissolubility and the importance of monarchy as a fundamental institution for European culture and civilization and order. So it's a little more complicated than that. But of course, the series is trying to bring us into the world of German politics by explaining, you can say, in part, the absurdity of the way that Germany is run. And it expands upon this a little later, but nevertheless, there is a slight agenda here. We are then introduced to the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, who is characterized as obedient to the Kaiser with his withered arm and his hatred for the Serbs. I think it's just important to sort of bring up. It's a German actor, Rainier Celine, who plays Kaiser Wilhelm II. I mean, he's no Barry Foster if we're going to bring in Fall of Eagles comparisons. But I think he brings enough nuance to the role. But at times, as with the Barry Foster portrayal, it does sort of come across as comical. And again, we are introduced to him on this anti-Serb tirade, effectively eliciting, genocidal thoughts towards the Serbs, which isn't too far from what the historic Kaiser Wilhelm II believed in terms of this perfidious race that needed to be dealt with. However, this cabinet meeting with the Kaiser brings up not only the nationality conflicts within Austria-Hungary, so again, it shows that the Kaiser is at least privy and understanding of the international situation in Europe, and it brings up his desire to see swift military action against the Serbs, specifically to shore up the Habsburg throne, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in spite of the idea of Russian protection towards the Serbs, as I mentioned during the previous crisis, the Bosnian crisis. And this is going to be very important because everything revolving Austria is virtually told from the German perspective, either through Jens's warped perspective or through the Kaiser's, you can say, arguably equally warped perspective. And as a result of this, I would say this is the weakest part of the series in terms of understanding the broad complexities between all of the powers, as opposed to the series' rather myopic focus on Britain and Germany. And to link Britain and Germany, we are then introduced to Prince Lichnowsky, the German ambassador to London, showing how he endures the Kaiser's eccentric personality, often displaying open annoyance and disgust. Um, But nevertheless, this is an opportunity to bring up the Kaiser's own views regarding Britain, and of course his naval policy as well. But all of this is to set up the blank check, which is to get the proverbial ball rolling. The blank check is handed in the series to the Austrian ambassador in Berlin, and Jen's comments, "Look at him, so smug. Hungarian nobility, that's their style." Now, this is where I become infuriated, absolutely infuriated with the series, because it then compounds this. So we talk about the Hungarian ambassador who doesn't say a word. He comes in incredibly foppish with this utterly preposterous moustache, and then it goes on to explain that the nature of the blank check, i.e., Germany's support of Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia, Germany required military action, was effectively the idea here. Now, what this does is utterly reduce Austria as nothing more than a dependent on Germany, something which is later reinforced by a statement made by Aircrow. And this is utterly preposterous because Austria had an incredibly precarious political situation revolving around certain powers. The emperor himself, Franz Joseph, the chief of military staff, Konrad von Herzendorf, the Belvedere Circle, which was represented by the now assassinated Franz Ferdinand, the chief minister of both the Hungarian part of the empire and the Austrian part of the empire, and of course the foreign minister Berchtold. Now, Berchtold and Herzendorf have been looking for a pretext for Austria to declare war on Serb or have some sort of preemptive war for years at this point. And so the idea that intervention is a German diktat is utterly preposterous. And I find this even more infuriating when we're introduced to the Hungarian ambassador, because it wasn't the Germans that were fed up with the Hungarian ambassador, it was the Austrians who were fed up with the Hungarian ambassador, Szonyi Máry. They believed that he was old, outmoded, and effectively needed to be replaced by a young radical. These new Foreign Office clerks at the Ballhausplatz, led by the chef de cabinet von Hoyers, who believed in, as with Herzendorf and as with Berchtold, this idea of a preemptive strike, particularly against Serbia. So the idea again that Austria is doing nothing but listening to the diktats of Germany is utterly preposterous. And again, I'm going to go as far as to say that the writers of this series have a chauvinism towards Austria and also turn a blind eye towards the machinations of France and Russia, which is unfortunate, especially given the fact that so much historical literature written in the last 20 years has done so much to try and remedy Austria's position within the historical narrative. And all this does is take us back to the notion that Germany was shackled to a corpse in the sense of Austria representing that course. And this is only compounded when we're introduced to Franz Josef himself, the emperor, who, according to Jens, works at his own stroke. And we are then introduced to this mass of correspondence on this desk, as if to imply that the empire's delay was simply due to the emperor's personal senility or inefficiency. Given the fact that the emperor had a rather incredible work ethic is, of course, completely ignored. But it's also the fact as if implying that the empire had no bureaucracy, and if the empire's entire political system rested on the emperor personally, which of course was not true. The emperor was a fundamental aspect of the system, obviously, but he was not the entire system. And again, implying that the empire's lack of agency, quote unquote, which I do not believe, was as a result of the emperor's senility. So now we come back to Britain, and the cabinet discuss the potential of an Irish mutiny over Home Rule. And this is cut short by news of the Black Hand's link to Princip. The Black Hand was a Serbian terrorist organization which had been responsible for the regicide of the previous dynasty, the previous king of Serbia, King Alexander, and by extension his entire dynasty, the Obrenović dynasty, which brought in a more Russian-friendly dynasty, the Georgievich dynasty. And consequently, they had effectively an informal role within the Serbian political apparatus. Serbia was technically a constitutional monarchy, but fundamentally, a large amount of the security apparatus within Serbia was linked to this effective paramilitary group operating within Serbia, which was very much irredentist, pan-Slavic, and anti-Austrian. So it's important to understand that the normal channels of the Serbian government were in some way compromised by this hidden, shadowy group. And so Gavrilo Princip's link to this group has serious consequences, albeit nothing regarding the nature of the Black Hand is brought up. And in fact, in rewatching this series, I was actually surprised they even mentioned the Black Hand. Crow then again repeats Jen's sentiments, effectively declaring that Austrian policy is made in Berlin. Having said that, again, Austrian can seldom act without Berlin's approval, is the more moderated version of that. Edward Grey then goes and plays cricket with Lichnowsky, and this achieves many things. First of all, it explains that it displays that there is a good working relationship between Edward Grey and Lichnowsky, but also it's an ability to sound out the Anglo-German view here. And Grey discusses the understanding with France and Russia not becoming involved in secret liabilities abroad without parliamentary knowledge. And this is really the first time where we sort of understand Edward Grey's own personal philosophy, which is that Grey is effectively an autonomous actor and has a very high-handed autocratic view of foreign policy, which effectively involves him acting on his own initiative, not giving up information towards Parliament, even to some cases towards his cabinet. And this is reinforced by a quote, "We are the surgeons, and we know how to use the knife." Now, what I find the general irony about this is what Ian McDermott's performance brings to this is essentially, and people have already mentioned it in the chat, a Palpatine-esque factor to Edward Grey, which he simply did not have. Edward Grey was a rather unimaginative fly fisher, to put it bluntly. His lack of sort of political imagination is almost legendary. And again, he, if anything, represents some form of microcosm regarding the incredibly precarious nature of the then liberal Asquith government at that time. He was a foreign minister despised by many on his own side, to the extent that he really only gave any sort of deliberations with three other ministers of the cabinet: Lord Haldane, who isn't shown in the series, Winston Churchill, and Herbert Asquith, the most hawkish of all of the members of the Liberal cabinet. Consequently, his foreign policy was not even backed by his own party. It was backed by the more warmongering Conservative Party at this point. So he himself represents not only the fragility within the party structure, the virtual autonomy of the Foreign Office, but it also gets the point across that Grey shoulders much of the responsibility regarding Britain's, you can say, haphazard approach to foreign policy during this time. And Neil Ferguson will go as far as to say, the historian Neil Ferguson, that Grey's lack of essentially a hard position on the Entente gave Germany the impression, especially Bethmann Hollweg, the impression that Britain would not intervene in the continent under any circumstances, which of course ultimately proved not to be true. But it was something that Edward Grey facilitated due to this incredibly internecine, complicated web of arrangements, which he was making virtually on his own volition, with tacit consent of Herbert Asquith, who is correctly presented here as nothing more effectively than a caretaker prime minister, a arbiter between all of the factions, an arbitrator between all of the factions. And that's very important to understand when you have very forceful personalities in the cabinet, like David Lloyd George and like Winston Churchill, and to a lesser extent, figures like Lord Morley. So the portrayal here is that Grey is autonomous because he has a mastery in terms of understanding of events and diplomatic suppleness and skill. And the reality here is that this was actually a fundamental weakness of the British position, and why I believe that essentially for the sympathetic view that the writers here give to Britain, and the lack of sympathy which they're prepared to give to Germany, let alone Austria, is that Britain's domestic situation and the lack of leadership here was ultimately critical in terms of understanding Britain's fateful decision to declare war on Germany on the 4th of August. Here we are really introduced to Winston Churchill and his own views. And again, in credit to the series, there's no attempt to mythologize Winston Churchill. He's routinely sort of rounded against by his own party officials. Morley refers to him as a blunderbuss, effectively. And he supports this view by saying, of war, the Kaiser knows nothing. We must treat him as a child. The only response is that of the raised hand. And again, this is very much sort of echoing the views of Sir Eyre Crowe, and the fact that Churchill believes in the military build-up. He, of course, is the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he believes in building enough dreadnoughts to completely eclipse the German naval build-up. Of course, Germany and Britain have been in this naval build-up race for around about a decade at this point. And from Churchill's point of view, this represented an existential threat to the British Empire by threatening Britain itself, by German warships being the other side of the Channel. So this is sort of important in terms of understanding the fraught nature, the delicate balancing act which Asquith has to play between all of these seemingly impossibly irreconcilable factions within the Liberal Party. I think this also goes some way to explain why the Liberal Party just collapses in the 1920s due to these insurmountable contradictions. And then we're finally introduced to what you can say is the presented antagonist of this series, which is Helmut von Moltke the Younger, who was introduced in the spa town of Carlsbad, taking the cure. And we're introduced to him effectively saying delay in Serbia will cause Russian agitation. So he knows that Bethmann Hollweg and the Kaiser are pursuing a policy of a localized war, i.e. Austria will just wipe out the Serbs and there won't be any international intervention. That is apparently not what von Moltke wants. Moltke instead wants the situation to escalate, and when he returns, it will be as effectively the instrument of a preventative war against Russia and by extension against France. I think it's sort of important to understand that the series does a good job in terms of trying to present this as a series of warring factions with a different set of views. And there's very much also the understanding of von Moltke that as the German chief of staff, um, he essentially had to come up with all possible contingencies for a two-front war since the 1894 Russo-French alliance. And he, of course, was building upon a plan made by his predecessor as chief of staff, the Schlieffen Plan, which involved defeating France by going through Belgium and then turning the army around to attack Russia, which would be slow to mobilize. I think my sort of frustration here is, however, in terms of how sort of again Moltke is brought up as effectively the Fritz Fischer-esque sort of villain within the saga, that Germany was ultimately responsible for the First World War and was planning preemptive strike. Now, to my mind, this doesn't hurt the overall picture that the series tries to give here. My issue here is that Germany is the only one presented as having any sort of devious motive. We are never seen the devious motive from France. We are never seen any devious motives from Russia, and neither are we also shown some, you can say, rather clandestine views within the British Foreign Office revolving around the possibility of Britain's self-interest being served by a general conflagration in Europe. I don't really want to expand on that here because it's something that the series doesn't really treat at all, so it wouldn't be necessarily relevant. But I think it's important here to color this perspective that Moltke really is the only one thinking about or wanting a general conflagration. And as a result of that, Germany, and you could say Germany's common perception as a villain, is reinforced here because there isn't the necessary comparison with the other powers to mitigate that view. And we're also here introduced to, I would say, a rather ridiculous scene where Bettman Holvig dresses down Soleimani, the Austrian ambassador, over the claim of harvest leave, which is a valid concern. The Austrians had attempted to mobilize the army, but of course they chose the worst time of year to do it, when most of the military conscripts were going back for the harvest. And Bettman Holvig dresses down the minister. He says, "Do not sit down," rather the ambassador, "do not sit down. You won't get another chance." And then, of course, when he leaves without uttering a word, it's like taking care of a pony. And again, this, I believe, is trying to exaggerate something which Bettman Holvig actually did at a much later date regarding the actual declaration of war against Serbia towards the end of the July crisis. And again, it's just this frustrating idea again, which the series is trying to reinforce, which is Austria is nothing more than Germany's poodle. It's nothing more than a ornament, which is in many ways a liability, and an infuriating liability, which is weighed down by its inefficiencies. And of course, there is some truth to the idea that Austria, of course, was militarily far less efficient, and that had Herzendorf and Berchtold looked for this pretext, when the opportunity arose, it was mechanically about time to do it. Nevertheless, again, it just reinforces this chauvinism towards the Austrian Empire. And of course, this is reinforced when the narrator also says Austria was weak and decadent while being vindictive, quick to take offense, slow to act, a nation resting on its dignity, as with the emperor. So I really, I mean, it just goes on from here. So we're introduced to the three cousins, Lichnowsky, Benkendorf, and Mensdorf, the respective ambassadors for Germany, for Russia. Benkendorf was a Baltic German, and of course for Austria-Hungary. And he's introduced Mensdorf as a comedic side character. He comes and tries to repeat the government's line on this ultimatum being given to Serbia, and the line is ignored by Gray, which evidence a total lack of respect for Mensdorf and, by extension, Austria. In reality, Mensdorf was a friend of Edward VII and now King George V, and he was probably the most prominent of all of the foreign ambassadors in the court of King George V, and was considered too Anglophile by Vienna, to the point that von Hoyos and the young radicals around Berchtold actually kept him in the dark about Austria's true intentions vis-a-vis Serbia. And again, just to destroy the view which is put across by this series, which uses every opportunity to denigrate Austria and turns Mensdorf into a side character, which will come back later in another episode as a punching bag. This is from Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers. When Count Mensdorf complained to Gray on the 17th of July of the excesses of the Belgrade press, Gray inquired rather oddly whether there was not perhaps one Serbian paper that had behaved decently. Mensdorf concluded, or conceded rather, that this might be the case, but went on to say that the dual monarchy could no longer tolerate political subversion at this level of intensity. Sir Edward Grey conceded this, Mensdorf reported, but did not enter into any further discussion of the subject. After receiving the text of the Austrian note to Belgrade, Grey invited Mensdorf to come to see him again on the 24th of July. It was on that occasion that he described the note as the most formidable document of its type that he had ever seen. But even on that occasion, the Foreign Secretary conceded that Austria's claim concerning the complicity of certain Serbian state agencies and even some of the demands listed in the note were justified. Now, the reason I bring that up is that that is the complete opposite of what we are presented in this as the comical dressing down of Mensdorf. And I believe, I think maybe it was season 2 of Game of Thrones to come out just before this, when we're introduced to a wonderful scene where Tyrion Lannister, who plays the Hand of the King, talks to Littlefinger, he talks to Grand Meister Pycelle, and he talks to oh, what's his name? The spider. Sorry, for some reason I forget his name. Someone in the chat will know who I'm talking about. And in that scene, he's basically presenting 3 contradictory proposals to 3 people to suss out who has betrayed him. And the reason I bring this up is that it seems that the writers here almost tried to create a similar situation in which Edward Grey's response changes depending on one of the 3 ambassadors. So to Mensdorf, it is addressing down, yes, Varys, thank you, as if he were a child. And of course, this is only reinforced when we look at his sort of response to the demands of the ultimatum, which is probably a good time to bring up the ultimatum, which again, in essence, what the series brings up is correct, but they're varnished to make the Austrian demands seem even more unreasonable than they were, i.e., anti-Austrian views should be censored, when in reality the text was not inciting hatred and contempt towards Austria, that pan-Slavic societies should be abolished, and not obviously mentioning that many of these pan-Slavic societies were also paramilitary organizations. And then we talk about negative references to the monarchy being removed from press and from schools instead of explicit anti-Austrian propaganda. Gray then admonishes Mensdorf that the ultimatum is designed to be rejected and calls him a fool, as he ultimately correctly opines about Russia and British military action against Austria. So I find it ironic that Mensdorf here, the comical Mensdorf of the series, correctly anticipates what the British and the Russians are going to do, and he is rushed off as a fool. And of course, Gray here confuses point 5 with point 6, point 6 being the major sticking point, which I'll argue which could not be accepted by the Serbs. The idea that police investigators collaborate with the Serbs to find out who was responsible ultimately for backing Princip and thereby, by extension, responsible for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So again, this is where I come back to the Game of Thrones example, because Gray's relationship with the 3 ambassadors is an opportunity to display Gray's diplomatic skill, intimidating with the Austrians, showing the extent of popular support for Serbia, while cooling Russia's response by basically saying that the British did not care about Serbs. I think there's a famous quote, maybe it's attributed to Edward Grey, I don't know, saying that the people of Manchester care about Belgrade as much as the people of Belgrade care about Manchester. But even in terms of you can say the presentation of it, when Mensdorf is brought in before Edward Grey. Mensdorf is standing, essentially like a naughty child being brought in to see the headmaster and then told off. When we're introduced to Grey and Crow and Benkendorf, they're all sitting down, and the tone is much calmer, far more diplomatic. And then, of course, this culminates with Prince Lichnowsky, the German ambassador, casually strolling through the garden without Crow there to antagonize the German, because, of course, we all know Crow's anti-German views here. So I believe they're trying to use this to extol the virtues of Edward Grey as a incredibly canny, you can say almost Machiavellian political operator. But all again, this does to me is just demonstrate how confused his foreign policy is. You can say, yes, on the one hand, he's trying to intimidate Austria, he's trying to moderate Russia, and he's trying to soothe the situation with Germany, which he ultimately believes is more responsible for how Austria acts than what the Austrians are telling him. Yet at the same time, it's important to understand that Grey effectively has no imagination. He's not sort of looking at the bigger picture in terms of Britain's long-term strategic interests. And I really believe, in terms of trying to understand what Grey is trying to do, Grey is a victim of his own sort of compounded system of agreements and expectations. He is the victim of his own sort of diplomatic expectations, so to speak. And this isn't even his own initiative. It was the initiative of his predecessor, the Foreign Secretary under Arthur Balfour, Lord Lansdowne. So Grey inherits the Entente Cordiale. He builds upon the Entente Cordiale, and then very much the logic of his entire thought is built around the Entente Cordiale. And here, the real struggle for Grey, as presented in the series, and really historically, given his lack of imagination, and you can say his blinkeredness concerning how this actually affects Britain's long-term interests, is should the peace of Europe be sacrificed for the sake of the Entente Cordiale, or vice versa, as ridiculous as that sounds. And again, the peace of Europe, the triple entente system, where does Britain ultimately feature into this? We fundamentally don't know. And it's here that we move away from Grey. We're introduced to Moltke very ominously, saying that the Little Balkan War will act as an acorn. The Little Balkan War will not remain a Little Balkan War. Again, trying to prophesize the intent on various German actors of escalating this conflict. When we're brought into episode 2, we are introduced to the Serb response to the Austrian ultimatum regarding Franz Ferdinand's assassination. It should also be noted regarding Grey, in terms of not being in command of events and not really understanding the gravity of what's going on. Between the 28th of June and the 24th of July, there was effectively no mention of this to the cabinet, no mention of any sort of foreign calamity or crisis. Grey was incredibly slow to understand the ramifications of the Sarajevo assassination and of the potentialities of even a localized conflict within the Balkans, let alone what would escalate in a matter of 1 week into a general European conflagration. This isn't really something you get across, because Grey is always having these meetings and discussions. But again, it's just to emphasize how Grey is conducting these conversations in the dark, and he himself is not even that invested in them to begin with, let alone this representing some form of unified response to the British government with some sort of plan as to how to respond to this situation. But here we finally have a response, which is when the cabinet discusses the Serb note post the Austrian ultimatum. Now, what I find rather frustrating is that Grey here, as Ian McDermott, basically denigrates the Serb note as submissive. And I think this is almost universally considered, the Serb note, as one of the most brilliant pieces of diplomatic correspondence in history, something which gives the impression that all of the points, all of the ultimatum points, from the anti-propaganda pieces to the police investigation revolving around Franz Ferdinand's assassination, all of this, which again, the thing which is repeated here, which isn't too far from the truth, the idea that Serbia will have to, in some respect, abandon its status as a sovereign independent nation. The brilliance of the response is that it is to some extent accepted. And the Austrians basically look at this and say, no, they haven't accepted any of our points. And yet some people, including the Kaiser, can look at this and say, every cause for war has now fallen back. It's no longer relevant. We can accept this. But the fact again that no one can really tell even to this day, and historians still disagree about this, shows that this was, you could say, a masterful piece on the Serb part of dissimulation, which also helps Russia, Serbia's backer, build international sympathy for Serbia as the injured party, when of course Austria views Serbia very much as the antagonist of this, as the instigator of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and this power with expansionist designs on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, combined with the Russians who want to dismember Austria at this point. Gray omits virtually all of this, despite the fact that virtually all historians agree that point 6, the police investigation into the assassination, was rejected. Now, the reason it was rejected is because it would have ultimately uncovered the Black Hand. And if the Black Hand was targeted as a result of some form of Austro-Serbian police investigation, it could have very likely resulted in some form of coup in Belgrade. So there were major political implications for the Serb government in terms of accepting the entire nature of the ultimatum as is. So effectively, they could go no farther. But of course, Grave actually says that everything was accepted. Mensdorf argues correctly in the series that the Serb response was crafted, again, was effectively not to our liking, that it was crafted to engender international sympathy, while leaving the possibility open for the implicit rejection of the ultimatum in toto. And again, Gray refers to Austria as the superannuated Austrian Empire, the decaying Austrian Empire, and the fact that Franz Ferdinand was despised in Vienna, his wife more so. Well, again, it doesn't really matter if Franz Ferdinand was despised in Vienna, accepting Gray's logic. The fact is, it was still an assault on the Habsburg monarchy, and the whole nature of the Great Power Alliance system again was built, especially in the East, upon these semi-autocratic monarchical regimes. And I find this really rather frustrating, especially bringing up the popularity angle, because Franz Ferdinand was not as unpopular as Edward Grey makes him out to be. He was very unpopular with Franz Joseph himself, with the emperor. And when he talks about the fact that Franz Ferdinand's wife was despised, more so the Countess Sophie Chotek, that was because it was a morganatic marriage, and Franz Ferdinand was supposed to marry a member of the blood royal. So again, this is just oversimplified in terms of making the Austrians seem more ridiculous than they really are. And this is where we get to, you can say, Gray's first serious attempt to get Britain to become involved in this crisis, which is an international tribunal for Serbian mediation. So between the 24th of July and the 28th of July, there are attempts to create a four-power conference involving Russia, France, Germany, and Britain to mediate the conflict revolving around Serbia and Austria-Hungary, which of course is definitely not what Germany wanted. They wanted a quick and decisive war, apparently, according to the Kaiser, before the Serbs had even become aware that it had begun. And Bettman Holvik effectively dictates the response, which is effectively keeping the Kaiser in the dark and rejecting any notion of mediation. It's important to note also that the Kaiser has been away in Norway at this time, and he only comes back to Germany on the 27th of July, 1914, just a few days before the declaration of war. And that I think is quite revealing, and again, a credit to the series, the fact that the Chancellor of Germany wants arguably the supreme warlord, the most powerful man in Germany, to be out of Germany at this time, so he can dictate the foreign and domestic affairs of the empire unimpeded. But nevertheless, there is an aspect of truth, and there is an aspect of truth to this. Then we come to, I believe, again, something where the series really fails in terms of trying to understand the broader context of what exactly is going on. When Alec again narrates for us, Russia was a mystery for us. When Russia began its secret mobilization, and this is attributed to, from Alec, the Tsar's personal unpredictability owing to his status as a powerful man. Now, I find this completely insulting. And I think the only way to look at this and trying to give the series some slack is that Alex's own ignorance regarding the Russian position is reflective of Gray's own ignorance of the Russian situation. Despite the fact that Gray had invested so much in Russia, the fact that we are brought up the idea again that the Triple Entente had allowed Gray to lessen tensions along the Afghanistan border and protect India, even though the Triple Entente was actually arranged to quell tensions in Persia, which isn't brought up, interestingly enough. Gray had very little interest in understanding the Russian position or in trying to find out what the Russians were up to. So George Buchanan was the British ambassador to St. Petersburg at this point. And 2 days after the quote unquote secret mobilization was started, this was attributed by the Russians, and again, apparently these are two allies, to dealing with strikes, a partial mobilization to deal with strikes. And why I find, again, this is so infuriating is that this is basically treated as I'm not even sure how to sort of properly characterize the momentousness of this decision. This decision to begin the partial mobilization immediately escalates the localized conflict in the Balkans into a potential European cataclysm, which it ultimately becomes. And this is passed off in the series as the whim of an unpredictable man. Again, trying to explain that Russia is so autocratic and the Tsar is so all powerful that there are no other competing interests. And this is only reinforced when you're introduced to Sokolminov, the Minister of War. And again, apparently his overweening control and influence over the Tsar. The Duma isn't brought up as a political consideration. The 1905 revolution is not brought up as a serious consideration. Oh, sorry, someone in the chats mentioned this repeatedly. Rumpelstiltskin. Everyone is biased. Rumpelstiltskin. Historians aspire towards total objectivity, but even in terms of the subjects we choose, we cannot avoid being biased. So thank you for that. You can stop saying that in the chat. But again, just to re-emphasize what I was saying about Russia, the Russian situation was probably as complicated as the situation in Germany, with as many warring factions, even within the army. There is a view coming around of certain historians regarding Sokolminov and the fact that he represents a faction called the Praetorians, which are representing mobile warfare against the patricians who are advocating for static warfare and the use of fortress artillery. And all of these sort of things are completely omitted. And we buy into this view, very much the Soviet view, which comes out in 1917, which is that Sokolminov was irredeemably corrupt, which is very much the charge laid against him by Polyanov, the later Russian Minister of War, and Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the eventual commander of Russian forces in the first stages of World War I. So all of this is very interesting, but of course, because the series decides to focus rather myopically on the greater extent Britain, to a lesser extent Germany, all of these interesting nuances regarding the other powers are omitted. And the only thing I find rather frustrating, again, in terms of trying to understand this, is that you could pass it off as a character flaw for Sir Edward Grey, him underestimating Russia's capacity and Russia's bellicosity during this period. But instead, the ignorance of Grey becomes the ignorance of the viewer, and by extension, the ignorance of the narrator. the idea that Russia was a mystery for us, again, it's just because of your diplomatic incompetence. And there's again another quote, and I haven't looked into this, so I apologize preemptively for not researching this beforehand. But Benkendorf talks to Grey and refers to the necessity of the alliance between Russia and Britain, which I need to emphasize. It's convenient for the Russians to believe there is an alliance, it's not convenient for the British to believe there's an alliance. There is an understanding, certainly, and an understanding that certainly did not pertain to Europe, it pertained to the Empire. But anyway, Benkendorf says, apparently quoting Gladstone, Russian and Britain stand on the edges of Europe, and if we should ever fall out, whatever runs between should fall under the dominion of Germany. Now, again, I need to sort of reinforce this view because it seems that, given Gladstone's, you can say, lack of interest regarding continental sort of diplomatic affairs, except for railing against Israeli in the Balkans. That it could be something Gladstone said, but I find it very unlikely that it's something that Gladstone said, especially because it very much fits into this post-World War II worldview that Germany was desperately seeking some form of European hegemony, as opposed to this being a preemptive war. Very much the impression here, which is reinforced by various actors, is the idea that Germany was seeking a pretext for a conflict and ignoring the fact that certainly Russia, to a lesser extent Austria and France, were also seeking pretexts for a general conflagration in Europe. The emphasis, as Sir Eyre Crowe would have it, is always on Germany and potential German hegemony in Europe, ignoring the fact also that Bismarck himself was very much against this. He hated the idea of Napoleonic style coalitions being formed against Germany. He believed that Germany's position must simply be held as the first nation in Europe, and by extension, Bismarck operating as Chancellor of Germany as the honest broker of the continent, having no formal sort of, you can say, dependency on any one alliance system, especially Austria, and effectively treating Germany as almost above international politics due to its position of strength and ultimately its position of preeminence among all of the European powers. And so when we get to the Kaiser and we introduce this idea of Weltpolitik and we introduce the German colonial empire, for someone like Bismarck, all this does is complicate the view of German relations. But nevertheless, again, to give the series some credit, this is represented as a factional issue, very much coming from the German army and its chief of staff, von Moltke. And it's here that we return in the series to von Moltke. And he discusses the idea, the necessity now for defensive mobilization against Russia's partial mobilization. And again, the idea that Russia could potentially rival us, Germany, and eclipse Germany if someone who is supposedly as antiquated as Sukhominov is replaced by a quote unquote modernizer. And again, this is attributed to massive corruption within the Russian Empire and the fact that the Germans have 6 times as many artillery pieces as the Russians. But again, as I mentioned, the situation is actually far more complex than that. But there is a kernel of truth here in terms of the fear of Germany that, as again, this isn't mentioned, but it's important to note, as France is investing very heavily in German industry, as France is investing very heavily in terms of German infrastructure, in terms of Russian infrastructure, Russian industry, building trains to facilitate Russian mobilization in the event of a war. Um, all of this um, is to prove, at least in the German mind, that the longer Russia is allowed to consolidate after its humiliation in the Russo-Japanese War and its humiliation after the Bosnian crisis, the more powerful Russia will become. Russia has more resources. Russia has strategic depth in terms of the sheer scale of its empire. Russia has a vast population. On the eve of the German declaration of war, Russia had a standing army, a pre-war army of 1.4 million men. All of this comes to prove that a Russian army, which is now receiving aircraft attachments for its various divisions, more artillery, better infrastructure, and together with France, will ultimately overwhelm and destroy Germany. So the idea is building, especially as is going to be articulated in the mind of the Kaiser later on, that there is an international conspiracy brewing, which is aiming to eliminate Germany. That to some extent was true, to some extent was not true in terms of the levels of power and the views of the people at time who actually had the power to implement such a strategy. But the view here very much is that Germany had an advantage in 1914 against Russia. The longer the delay, the more Russia could consolidate its resources, consolidate its relationship with Britain, use various uh, pro provocations in the Balkans to create a pretext, as with the Sarajevo assassination, and Germany and Austria, which do not have a vast international empire like Britain to fall back on, or a vast contiguous empire like Russia to fall back on, will ultimately be surrounded and destroyed. And here, Jens narrates effectively the fundamental difference between Kaiser Wilhelm II and von Moltke, in the way that the Kaiser supposedly only thinks one step ahead, and that Moltke is thinking about preemptive war. Again, in fairness to the Kaiser, that's Moltke's job. Moltke, as the peacetime chief of staff, the German chief of staff is, in sort of Clausewitzian terms, is just there to come up with every future possibility of every potential conflict and plan for it. That's the purpose of a German chief of staff. But of course, when we look at Kaiser Wilhelm II, there was a general frustration, even from among figures like Bebman Holvig, who were looking for a localized war in Serbia and were not looking for a general conflagration, that the Kaiser was ultimately wet. He wasn't this bellicose, warmongering figure that was characterized in Allied propaganda during World War One. Rather, he was the figure that German propaganda represented him, the man who did not want this war, the man who was not responsible for his declaration. He was a victim of circumstance, and they effectively believe that he was more pro-peace than many of the members of his own cabinet, which I find rather interesting in terms of consider. And the view from Bettman Holvig during the July crisis was the fear that the Kaiser would suddenly go soft and would counteract the decisions made by those who believed they were effectively following the laws of necessity, and that to dither and delay and to backtrack, as the Kaiser was prophesied doing, would simply put Germany in a precarious, if not fatal position. So it's interesting to consider that it's brought up very tangentially here. It's reinforced when we get into the later scenes within this mini-series. The fact that while the Kaiser was seemingly very bellicose when it came to the declaration of war by Austria on Serbia, when it comes to the idea of a general conflagration, he balks from this idea. And this is reinforced with earlier iterations in this history, even looking back at the Eulenburg affair, which very much damages his confidence, and I believe precipitates for him a moment of depression. The idea that figures in his cabinet like von Holstein were wanting to force the Kaiser into a more bellicose position. And when we look at his naval strategy, was very much the whole naval buildup of Germany was very much the Kaiser's own, as stemming from the Kaiser's own policy making. Tirpitz, the admiral responsible here, was simply the instrument of the Kaiser's will. I do believe that the concentrated force of naval armaments in the North Sea was a peacetime strategy in order to gain various international concessions through diplomatic conferences rather than a serious instrument of war. And this is only proven when we have the First World War, when we have the Battle of Jutland, how Britain maintained naval supremacy throughout the entire war, and when the High Seas Fleet leaves port and engages at Jutland, it essentially is almost like an irrelevant skirmish in the grand scheme of things. The situation remains as it was before the battle, with Britain naval supremacy and the British naval blockade. But all of this, again, is to consider the nuances regarding Kaiser Wilhelm's own perception of the situation and how he differed from someone who was looking at the possibility of a preventative European conflagration like von Moltke. We are then introduced to Franz Josef again through a voiceover narration and his declaration of war against Serbia. And again, just in terms of the the general ridiculous Austrian chauvinism here. Jens tells the audience to look at the emperor's face. He might be signing an ordinance for street lighting in Budapest. In reality, he is signing his death warrant and that of his dynasty. Now, again, this is just to reinforce the idea that the emperor was senile and had no idea what he was doing. There's a 1969 film adaptation of a play, Oh, What a Lovely War. Of course, the What a Lovely War is a tragicomedy surrounding the futility of the First World War. And in that film adaptation, this is starring uh, Gielgud, of all people, as Foreign Minister Berchtold. We are introduced to Emperor Franz Josef playing Bach on the organ very ostentatiously. And then Berchtold marches into his office and basically implores the emperor, very much sort of against his better judgment. The emperor doesn't speak, but he conveys all of this simply through his expressions. I don't know who the actor is, but he conveys the attitude very effectively, where Berchtold convinces Franz Josef that when he signs the declaration of war, he is simply acknowledging what is already existing on the ground, the fact that Austrian detachments and Serbian detachments are already fighting. And what I find fascinating about this, again, it was exaggerated in Oh, What a Lovely War, and Berchtold later goes on to say he was lying, but there was an element of truth in that, which is that Serbian mobilized detachments had crossed over accidentally into the Austrian Empire, and that was used as a potential skirmish, as a pretext formally, together with the ultimatum, to declare war on Serbia on the 28th of July. So I find it fascinating that this 1969 adaptation, which is basically a part of the tragicomedy of Oh, What a Lovely War, is actually truer, more true to the spirit of the real history than this actual sort of historical documentary was, even in terms of displaying Franz Josef, who is effectively crying with the declaration of war. And there's a comical man standing there prepared to take the emperor's happy portrait, having just signed the declaration of war, and the emperor will have none of it. So it is possible to actually convey these things with some sort of emotion and depth, even without Franz Josef having to say a single word. But here, the series completely botches it. We return again to the idea of Gray's policy of mediation, and this is where we really get into the time of implicit threats of an Entente coalition. Remember, this is only just a few days before Britain's declaration of war in Germany. I think it's rather difficult in terms of conveying the space of time, because in the first episode, we cover most of the we cover effectively the first sort of 30 days within the first episode, and in the subsequent two episodes we focus on the last week, because it's called the July crisis. The July crisis really doesn't begin until the 24th of July, and obviously culminates on the 1st of August, and just simply compounds after that. So I sort of think the idea of a July crisis is a bit of a misnomer, because there is almost a full month between the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the possibility of a European war, which ultimately happens. So it's difficult, I think, to portray the passage of time in this sense, but moving on, it's only of a matter of about 4 days where Gray is seriously proposing his idea of mediation, which I believe was damned to begin with. And as Gray is moving slowly towards this idea of fostering this idea of the Entente becoming an alliance and using it as some sort of deterrent against Germany and Austria, someone like Neil Ferguson will basically say, well, here Gray is effectively complicit in the escalation of the conflict because Britain's position is so unclear. And here, Britain is trying to present itself as the honest broker, despite the fact that Gray knows that he cannot present himself as the honest broker because of the expectations put upon Britain by its de facto allies at this point, Russia and France. We are then finally sort of introduced to Paul Campbell. And what I would argue is a mistaken reading of the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 by the narrator. Paul Cambon, of course, was the French ambassador to London, and by mistaken reading, the Franco-Russian alliance is basically written off as a consequence of German expansionism, which is not. And I think it's almost impossible to understand Russian motivations, certainly, for entering into alliance with France in terms of the fear solely of German expansionism. But of course, it suits the sort of view which the series is trying to put across. So there's that. Um, and again, note the French are only introduced 5 days before Britain's declaration of war, with no mention of Viviani and Poincaré's visit to Russia, the strategic timing of the Austrian ultimatum, the French culpability and support, full support of the Russian partial mobilization, Russia's support in terms of financing Serbia at this time, and Russia's support, France's support for Russia in terms of intervening in the Balkan War of 1912 and the Balkan War of 1913, that perhaps if played slightly differently could have created a World War One type situation slightly earlier than what we have. All of this is ignored. And this, I believe, fits into a rather conventional Francophilic view which emphasizes France's passivity. Such evidence for this is often taken with the fact that not only was Poincaré on board a ship with Viviani, the Prime Minister, the President, and the Prime Minister of France at the same time were basically incommunicado, and then they went to Sweden, ostensibly on holiday. Well, this wasn't true. They were going to Sweden to sound out the Swedes on neutrality during the conflict with Germany. And the reason why they were Viviani, the president, the prime minister, and Poincaré, the president and the foreign minister, were not willing to come back to France was they wanted the situation effectively to escalate to the point when they came back, almost the declaration of war and the German war against Russia was effectively a fait accompli by that point. But they had already confirmed the decisions being made in Moscow, and I think all of this. I'm sorry, in St. Petersburg, and all of this does again because Gray is still represented by the series here with Ian McDermott as a rather sort of masterful, again the master of information as presented at the beginning with the anecdote about the telegrams. And what I find so fascinating about this is Gray is almost completely ignorant of what's going on because France and Russia have a real working alliance, an alliance, especially from France's point, which is built upon the assumption that a war is coming and we need Russia to be in a position to be able to fight that war when a suitable pretext arises. But of course, Gray, the man who has invested so much diplomatically with France and Russia to the point that he will eventually use it as his pretext for siding with them in the First World War, is completely ignorant of their motivations. And the fact that it seems ostensibly that the French are goading the Russians on to bear down on Austria, to gain concessions, or if not, spark a general conflagration. And this comes down to the idea of revanche. And this is only sort of very ominously mentioned in this series once, which is when Prince Lichnowsky and Paul Cambon, the German ambassador and the French ambassador to London, respectively, find themselves in the same room. And Paul Cambon rather childishly moves out the way and creates a space between Prince Lichnowsky and himself. And Lichnowsky asks Cambon, "Have you been waiting long?" And Cambon responds to Lichnowsky saying, "Only since 1870. And the impression I get there, because the audience is not going to understand what that means if they don't have an understanding of the history, is that Cambon has been waiting for this in terms of the revanche, the revenge against Germany, since the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War and since the loss of Alsace and Lorraine. But of course, given everything we know about France communicated in this series so far, which is effectively nothing, um, you're only sort of left scratching your head as to the implications of that. But it is an ominous indication of what is essentially happening at this point. Then it should be noted that we're finally getting to the intricacies of how Germany is going to begin attacking France now that Russia is accelerating its plan for mobilization. And on the 29th of July, it will increase its partial mobilization to a total mobilization, which more than any single factor is the cause for a general European war between France, Germany, Austria, and Russia, if not Britain, as of yet. And here, Bettmann Hollweg is discussing with von Moltke the German strategy during this. And again, I find this scene rather implausible. And this is only, I think, to communicate this idea to the audience. Um, but Hollweg basically discusses with Moltke that France is impregnable because the French-German border on the French side is secured by a series of forts, most notably Verdun. And of course, this means that Hollweg is completely ignorant of the long established plans of the General Staff since before Moltke, since von Schlieffen, to bypass French forts by attacking through Belgium. And this is later sort of reinforced when you have Herr Crow looking at these maps of German railways, I think, in the Rhineland, and talking about this is all built for a mobilization plan through Belgium. Again, sort of indicating that the British were just as ignorant of the plan to attack Belgium as apparently Bettmann Hollweg, the Chancellor of Germany, was. And here I just want to read another segment from The Sleepwalkers, because I think it's indicative essentially of where the strategic thinking was and how everyone wasn't just a stunned bystander when looking at the idea that Belgian neutrality was ultimately going to be violated if Germany had to attack France through Belgium. The question of Belgium seemed unlikely to trigger an intervention from Britain. It was widely assumed, on the basis of both military intelligence secured by the French General Staff and of military inference, that the Germans would approach France through Belgium, breaching the 1839 International Treaty, guaranteeing its neutrality. The 1839 International Treaty, it should be noted, was signed by Prussia, then became Germany, France, and Great Britain. And really, the main consideration was actually of Dutch aggression, not of German aggression. France was considered the more aggressive power in 1839. But nevertheless, Belgium was basically acknowledged as a European necessity after they had successfully revolted against the Dutch. The cabinet took the view, while Britain was indeed a signatory to the treaty, the obligation to uphold it fell on all the signatories collectively, not on any one of them individually. And again, in fairness to the series, this is something tangentially brought up. Should the matter actually arise, they concluded, the British response would be one of policy rather than obligation. Indeed, it is striking with what sang-froid senior British military and political leaders contemplated a German breach of Belgian neutrality. On the basis of Anglo-French staff conversations in 1911, the Chief of Military Operations, Henry Wilson, who also, it should be noted, had a vested interest in wanting to have a military engagement so as to bypass the situation in Ireland, had come to the conclusion that the Germans would choose to cross the Ardennes through southern Belgium, confining their troops to the area south of the River Sambre and Meuse. These findings were presented to the 114th meeting of the Committee of Imperial Defence. The same scenario was discussed by the Cabinet on the 29th of July, when Lloyd George showed, using a map, why it was likely that the Germans would cross only the furthest southern corner of Belgium. So again, unlike how the series presents, which is essentially something which is completely, especially to Lloyd George, something which is almost completely unbelievable, the idea that the Germans would violate international law and violate Belgian neutrality. No, it was basically an understood military influence. It was a supposition on all sides. Far from greeting the prospect with outrage, the ministers accepted it as a strategic necessity from Germany's standpoint, and thus virtually inevitable. British strategic concerns were focused primarily on Antwerp and the mouth of the River Schelde, which had always been regarded as one of the keys to Britain's security. I don't see, Churchill commented, why we should come in if they go only a little way into Belgium. Lloyd George later claimed that he would have refused to go to war if the German invasion of Belgium had been confined to the route through the Ardennes. British policymakers assumed in any case that the Belgians themselves would not make their last stand in the south, but would, after offering only token resistance to demonstrate that they had not permitted the violation of their territory, fall back on their lines of fortification further to the north. There would thus be nothing automatic about the relationship between a German invasion of Belgium and British intervention in the conflict. So all of this again is to emphasize that none of this should have come as a surprise to either the instigators of the plan or those reacting to it, as in the British and the French, and they had responded accordingly. And again, when we talk about a pretext, Britain was fundamentally concerned with the neutrality of effectively the neutrality or not falling into German hands, the channel ports, both the northern channel ports of France and the ports of Ostend and Antwerp in particular in Belgium. So that's something important to consider because, again, this is something which the show springs on the audience. And again, all of this does, I think, serves as make everyone in all the international departments look rather stupid and again contradict this idea that the Foreign Office is some sort of vault with all the secrets in the world and that Grey is the master of secrets. Of course, that almost proves to be utterly preposterous here. This ends with a very interesting point, which I'm sure a lot of people sort of won't be familiar with. But again, I think it presents it in such a way as to give Grey the benefit of the doubt. When Grey, after a cabinet meeting where there seems again to be at an impasse, we see the divisions within the cabinet where Churchill is talking about France as an alliance, we finally bring up the idea of the naval treaty of 1912, and we bring up the peace sentiments of Lord Morley and John Burns. And it's really here, again, that as a last-ditch attempt, now that Edward Grey's plan for a peace mediation has failed, that Edward Grey makes a call to Prince Lichnowsky that there would be an Anglo-French neutrality guarantee to localize the war to the east between Austria, Germany, and Russia. Later, he declares to Crow that he wasn't exactly sure what he said, i.e., that he had intentionally been vague to give the intention, essentially, an intentional dissimulation bluff to buy time for France. And you can say that this is the height and the end of Grey's one-man policy making for the British Empire. And I think it's not something that the series really gets across. For the series, it almost presents this as a moment of diplomatic brilliance. But I see this because it did, of course, happen historically. At least Prince Lichnowsky took from it what he wanted to hear, and he told Berlin as such. And then we have this rather sort of dramatic scene with the Kaiser and von Moltke, that this was the end of the road for Grey. His peace initiatives had failed. He had failed to deter a German escalation or German preemptive war. He had failed to calm Russia in its response to Austria. And again, Russia was being goaded by the French. So all of this is fascinating. The way the series presents it again is again a moment of diplomatic brilliance, but I would construe it from Grey as a moment of moral bankruptcy and a moment of utter desperation. The episode ends with the postponed Luxembourg invasion, which again is quite a nice little anecdote to end it. The detachment of German troops going over, and the one injury being the one German soldier who sprained his ankle while they were trying to capture a telegraph post. But of course, this was the beginning of the war. But it wasn't to be at that time because the trains are turned around as a result of this diplomatic bluff. But of course, because this was a moment of total desperation on the part of Grey, the bluff collapses under the realization that the French will never agree to sacrifice their alliance with Russia. And again, in terms of this is also my sort of view that it indicates to Grey how limited his understanding was of the Franco-Russian alliance. And all this perhaps did was inadvertently accelerate the war by buying time again for the Russians to mobilize and gain even more of an advantage against Germany. And as we know, when the Russians do attack, even though they do ultimately attack prematurely, and there's the disaster at the Second Battle of Tannenberg, the Russians are able to attack Germany far sooner than anyone had anticipated. The Kaiser, having been sort of demonstrated as go and get the champagne, the British have come to save us, Edward Grey has come to save us. This reinforces the idea of a general betrayal by Britain. And it's at this point that the Kaiser basically concedes to Moltke the necessity of a two-front preventative war. And again, there is an aspect of historical truth in this, because the Kaiser certainly does become convinced that Germany is not just the victim of a conspiracy launched by Britain, but in his exile in Holland, this will be compounded by other international factors as well. And there are hints of this earlier, especially with the Daily Telegraph fiasco some 7 years earlier, where he talks about the British as mad as March hares, all of his efforts to um, engender warm feelings and an alliance between Britain have fallen on deaf ears, and he concludes that this is the result of some seemingly sort of pathological hatred of the British towards the Germans. And perhaps, again, that would be reinforced with the idea that Britain's position in terms of wanting to establish some sort of continental intervention against Germany does seem, ultimately, in hindsight, rather pathological and self-defeating. But I'll leave that there. It's here now we come to the real possibility of war. We are mentioned, Keir Hardie and the socialists are mentioned, and their general antipathy towards war. Of course, back then, the socialists were pacifists. They believed in defending European civilization and not getting into the quote-unquote capitalist war, which is only reinforced to a much greater extent when we talk about Lenin and capitalism and imperialism as final stage capitalism. Here, ironically, as the series presents, the Bank of England agrees with Keir Hardie and the socialists. And again, in terms of trying to understand the political makeup of Britain at that time, Asquith's government was a minority government which was contingent on support from the Labour Party. So the fact that the Labour Party are averse to war has a political bearing on the situation and will drive certain members of the Liberal Party closer towards the more pro-war conservatives. But this is also a point where the series brings up the fact that war will be a financial disaster. It will be a particular disaster for Britain owing to its status as an international trading nation and honest broker, and that this would have severe implications and ramifications directly for Britain. Then we return to the German counterpart, which is Moltke and Bettmann-Hollweg discussing their socialists, the Social Democrats. And again, perhaps this is quite artfully done in the fact that it's mentioned very briefly, but enough to demonstrate that Germany has the largest socialist movement in the world at that point. The Social Democrats are, I believe, have been the largest party in the Reichstag since 1912. And due to the precarious nature of German politics at that time, Bettmann-Hollweg wanted to engender Reichstag support, even though it wasn't ultimately necessary, because Germany was effectively, the military direction of Germany was determined by the Kaiser. But of course, facilitating support with Parliament would have been conducive, especially for Bettmann-Hollweg, who was trying to strengthen the civilian arm of government against control of the military. So here we see Moltke and Hollweg ultimately using the Social Democrats, and as Hollweg sort of ominously declares, a successful war will give us the pretext to eliminate socialism forever. So, and again, it's interesting that Hollweg mentions that, because that is certainly the view of some members of the Junker aristocracy and the German army, the idea that a preventative war will help Germany's internal predicament, i.e., if the Kaiser can be seen to be militarily strong and the army can gain this victory, then it'll be a equivalent of 1870, 1871 again. Germany will be triumphant, Germany will conquer, and it'll be as a result of the German army. And there are certain things in recent German history, like the Saarbrunn affair, involving a German lieutenant basically inciting violence against Alsatians, not the dogs, obviously, but the population of Alsace-Lorraine, which is already a trouble spot to begin with, which have sort of tarnished the popular image of the sort of heroic German officer corps, the German army. So again, this is an attempt to restore this Bismarckian notion of the all-powerful sort of military aristocracy again, and eliminating the socialists, which had been a perennial problem for Bismarck. And you can argue that Kaiser Wilhelm II had fundamentally failed in terms of controlling them as an opposition, to the extent that they had become one of the largest political parties, not just in Germany, but in Europe at that point. We come back to Britain again, and Cambon and Gray discuss the confidential naval agreement and the fact that this was done without cabinet or let alone parliamentary consent, whereby the French Navy was positioned in the Mediterranean and the Royal Navy guarded the Channel. So effectively, as a result of this, France's own military defense, France's defense of the northern coasts, had been imperiled by this agreement had Britain not gone to war alongside France in any future conflict with Germany. This is compounded by the fact that Germany has the second largest navy in the world at this time. So the High Seas Fleet would serve as a real threat to France, and by extension, the United Kingdom in the Channel, with German boats in the Channel. And you can say again, in terms of trying to, the series almost tries to present some sort of tragic inevitability to this. But again, I would argue that this is just compounding the meandering and contradictory nature of Grey's foreign policy. And very correctly, Churchill comes and brings up this point later and says that this naval agreement has placed the security of northern France at England's disposal, all of the commitments and none of the advantages of deterrence. Again, you can almost say reinforcing Neil Ferguson's point that Britain, throughout the crisis up until the end, lacked any coherent system of deterrence to be able to offer Germany the stick if it indeed wanted to side with their alliances and stop a general conflagration in Europe. Indeed, it was the ambiguity and the secrecy of the British position, not just to her international partners, but also to domestic opinion, which you can say got Britain into this position where all of these covert entanglements forced her into a position which ultimately became self-defeating and you can argue fatal in terms of the long scope, the long-term history of the British Empire. It should also be noted that the only British newspaper at this time, which had been advocating for constantly for military intervention in Europe, had been the Times. Virtually all other newspapers were opposed to a military conflict up until August of 1914. So really, you can say that this almost is like a blind flash. This comes out of nowhere, and suddenly the entire nation is enthusiastically going off, volunteering to fight, to bash the Bosch. And of course, it just seems preposterous given the fact that there was very little in terms of a general swelling of popular opposition to Germany, and it very much relies on the Belgian pretext to push that over. And of course, the fact that the political situation in Britain is so fraught. And again, Grey's autonomy in this is not a strength for the British system, but very much a weakness. The fact that Grey has been making all of these contradictory agreements, which have imperiled the peace in Europe, on his own volition, and again, only with the tacit support of, say, for example, the more hardline bellicose members of the Liberal government, such as Asquith and the Conservative Party. And this is ultimately sort of addressed. We have a dressing down of Edward Grey in Cabinet, where Lord Morley says, Grey has left us without the liberty of our own decision-making, having promised Parliament that Britain had no international entanglements, while effectively misleading the Cabinet. And it's here where Asquith presents an ultimatum to Parliament to back Grey or lead the pro-war, pro-conscription Conservatives into power. And here, afterwards, Morley discusses with Lloyd George the Boer peace campaign and the possibility of a resignation. So what we're seeing is the breakdown of the Liberal Party, showing the irreconcilable conflicts within that party, and how essentially it would take a charismatic figure like a Lloyd George, someone who will eventually become prime minister, ironically the wartime prime minister in 1916, to lead a peace faction. And again, I think maybe this is this is a consequence of sort of Morley's own position, or Morley's own delusion during this period. But my view is that David Lloyd George had effectively already surrendered his pro-peace policy by then. Um, the Boer campaign, in terms of sort of 1914, it might as well be ancient history. It was 12 years ago at that time, and Lloyd George had turned towards the Hawks, towards people like Churchill and Edward Grey, in denouncing Germany over the gunboat Agadir crisis in Morocco in 1911. So already we see hints that Lloyd George will move towards his position, which comes to fruition in 1914 and crystallizes when he becomes a leader of a conservative and national liberal coalition and the wartime prime minister. It's here that we return to Germany, where Moltke discusses the advantages of a two-front war and the Belgian scrap of paper, and correctly states again, as I just read from Christopher Clark, that the guarantee was a collective guarantee of all the powers, and it wasn't just the sole responsibility of Britain to uphold that treaty. So, say, for example, if the French and the Germans violated it in terms of their conflict with one another, that Britain wouldn't necessarily, according to the strict reading of the treaty, have to intervene simply against one of the parties. And again, we see continued escalation. Cambon suggests the formation of a British expeditionary force to the continent. And again, Grey's denial. Grey is still here believing that such an idea is utterly preposterous, and yet within less of a week it'll become a reality. And I think it's also important to mention that here, Lichnowsky has a certain naivety concerning Belgian neutrality when we go back to him. Lichnowsky is one of these fascinating figures in terms of the fact that he was almost more sort of positively inclined towards the British than he was towards the Germans, and found himself completely at odds with German domestic opinion. We're introduced to him, Prince Lichnowsky, in this series as being a friend of the Kaiser, but nevertheless, it should be noted that when we finally have the declaration of war against Germany by Britain on the 4th of August, Lichnowsky was so highly regarded that a British guard of honor saluted the German ambassador, there were now hostilities between those nations, which again was almost impossible in terms of those circumstances. And then he reads his he writes a pamphlet 2 years later on the supposed causes of World War One, where again he places the blame on Germany and by extension Count Berchtold of Austria for facilitating this original conflict. So it's interesting to consider that his own position, that Lichnowsky was completely at odds with figures like von Moltke and even more moderate figures who had only wanted the localized conflict, such as the Chancellor, Bettmann Hollweg. Nevertheless, with the real possibility now of a German invasion of Belgium on the 3rd of August, this galvanizes figures such as Winston Churchill, very almost cynically using it as a pretext, oh, well, now we'll have public sympathy to go to war and finally have that continental intervention. And here we finally have, you can say, Grey actually trying to justify his decisions. And again, this is a way to try and engender sympathy for Ian McDiarmid as Grey, where Grey and Churchill suggest to Morley about the honour, the principle of supporting treaties against Lord Morley and his prophecy. Ultimately, it turns out to be correct, of a European calamity. And I do want to suggest this because, I mean, as I've just read out with my passage revolving around Belgian neutrality, the main concern with Belgian neutrality was that not of the whole idea of protecting Belgium, but of securing the Channel, which the British had made, ironically, more vulnerable because of their agreement with France, whilst entangling France with Britain at the same time, making their defense interdependent. So I find this whole idea of supporting honor and supporting treaties rather frivolous. And then we come back to this idea which Grey states, which is the idea of being friendless on the continent, that should France and Russia win the war, we will find ourselves without friends. We will find ourselves totally isolated in the same way that if Germany and Austria win the war, then they will potentially have a hostile coalition in the continent. And again, Gray states this here, but Gray states this later, I believe it's in 1925, when he tries to justify his positions and justify his conducts in the lead up towards the war, talking again like Crow does about the inevitability of German hegemony on the continent. And again, that could be said with the benefit of hindsight. But even though I think it's a incredibly sort of fallacious view, and what I see this as, again, it's not honoring treaties so much as it's sort of honoring expectations. The view here is that Gray was very much fulfilling the logic of the alliance system, which hadn't really even crystallized by that point, to the extent that he was prepared to sacrifice Britain's interests and the lives of 500,000 British troops, bankrupt the British Empire, for a international conflict, which ultimately only had the ultimate result of precipitating another much worse conflict 20 years down the road. So I think in terms of sort of trying to understand his viewpoint, um, I just tried to find it quickly. There is a quote by Crow regarding the logic of Gray's position. Of course, Crow takes it further than Gray because Gray was dithering and somewhat contradictory, especially mentioned the idea of a Anglo-German détente in 1914 that didn't happen, it never materialized. But this, I believe, is ultimately the position which Gray adopted, and this is a statement made by Crow. Whatever we may think of the merits of the Austrian charges against Serbia, France and Russia consider that these are the pretexts, and that the bigger cause of the Triple Alliance versus Triple Entente is definitively engaged, i.e., the unlocking of the alliance system. I think it would be impolitic, not to say dangerous, for England to attempt to controvert this opinion, or to endeavour to obscure the plain issue by any representation at St. Petersburg and Paris. Our interests are tied up with those of France and Russia in the struggle, which is not for the possession of Serbia, but one between Germany aiming at political dictatorship in Europe and the powers who desire to retain individual freedom. So again, this is made on a presupposition that a preventative war from Germany based on the Russian mobilization, which again the British were ignorant of and failed to mitigate with their half-hearted attempts at mediation, was ultimately a post hoc pretext. And again, Gray sort of confirms this even in the series when it is emphasized that France, not Belgium, is the real sticking point, that Britain has become intractably linked with France, and that Belgium was simply a very effective, as Churchill says in the series, casus belli, to galvanize public support for the invasion and create a list of willing volunteers, ultimately before conscription is introduced in 1916. So it is sort of fascinating, but I do sort of find it sort of strange that given what we get out of this series with Gray's character portrayal, I can read all of this. I can read all of this from what we're given with the character, even though it's presented in a more sympathetic tone, even though he is almost portrayed in command of events to a much greater extent than he ultimately was. And again, I think it's Ian McDermott's performance which gives the real sort of historical Grey a gravitas and a Palpatine-esque sort of manipulation, which the real Grey didn't have. And maybe that's a positive thing to the series, maybe that's a detriment, I don't know. But in reality, the notion of a principle was the last-ditched attempt to justify what was ultimately for Britain, you can say, the biggest diplomatic blunder, not maybe in Britain's history, but maybe in world history, in terms of ultimately contradicting and sacrificing Britain's interests for a incredibly dubious cause, which was evident to members of the Liberal government at that time. So Jens then goes on to conclude with from the German perspective, a quote from Rousseau: "It is folly to remain wise when all men around you are mad, And then Jens is conscripted, and Bettman Holbig laments the whole military dominance in Germany, that under his stewardship he had wished that Germany would become a state with an army and not vice versa, which of course is going off the old Voltaire quote that Prussia is an army with a state. And of course, in contrast, Alec volunteers for service. And I don't know, I think the impression I get from that is that Jens is unwillingly being conscripted into a policy effectively that he believes is only going to destroy Germany, of course, with the benefit of hindsight and him being a Democrat. Maybe that's from his point of view, that's true, but of course, he's not a real person. He's a fictional insert of the writers. And then, of course, that's contrasted with Alec, who volunteers for service, as if again to give the impression that Britain's position was predicated on principle. And that is very much reinforced with Margot Asquith, who outlines to Grey, outlining Britain's position ultimately, that when everything else is discarded, there is nothing left but principle. And effectively, Alec and Jens narrate the epitaph of Europe and the irony of Austrian declaration of war against Russia. And that's where the series ends. So I would perhaps recommend that everyone watch this series, especially if you're unfamiliar with the events of the quote unquote July crisis, because it gets across many specific events and characters which the general public simply will not be accustomed to, in the same way that The Fall of Eagles, I believe, is a much better series, but it has serious flaws. Nevertheless, I would argue that you would watch it anyway. I believe Fall of Eagles is superior to the 37 days. And I will emphasize here that the main issue with the 37 days is, you can say, its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It doesn't just focus on the British perspective. It tries to broaden the perspective by giving us an understanding of the nature of the German political system and the German interest in the conflict, albeit I would say imperfectly and through a rather warped lens, but it could be much worse. However, the problem is when you try and broaden the scope, when you try and introduce a comparative approach to your study by giving you that multiple perspective between Britain and Germany, you then can't caricature and ignore the perspectives of the other powers whose views and have agency and are pertinent to what is going on in the July crisis. France through almost total omission and a implication of passivity, Russia through gross oversimplification, and Austria as being treated as an object of chauvinism and ridicule. So I would like to recommend this series more, but those aspects, especially for me who focuses on that side of things, on that side of history, who is, I would like to say, as familiar with Russian, French, and Austrian history as I am familiar with German history, finds this rather infuriating to watch. And I'm still sort of at a loss in terms of how I feel about Ian McDermott's performance. Because, like I said, I, on a personal level, love Ian McDermott as an actor. I love him as Palpatine, but I feel that he was miscast in this role. For again, my impression might, if I were directing this, I would want to give the impression that Gray was a bungler and a victim of his own impossibly complicated and contradictory foreign policy, rather than a master political maneuverer who finds himself in this position almost as a result of events beyond his control, which is very much the impression I get with the epitaph towards the series. But thank you all for listening to this review, and I'll quickly get to the super chats. Spasticus Autisticus for £50. Well, thank you very much, Spasticus Autisticus. That's very kind of you, and just says welcome back with a heart. So that's very kind of you. Thank you. I know I have been gone for a few months, but I'm back, and I hope to be producing more content as of now. So thank you very much again. Right, Lofi Dante for $5 Canadian. Thank you. It's good to see you again, AM. I can't watch this live, but we'll look forward to listen. Hopefully, we're able to hear more from you soon. Well, I hope so too. So thank you very much. All right. Conovan, I don't know what that currency is, but there is $50 of it. So thank you very much, Conovan. That's very kind of you, and just gives a thumbs up again. So thank you. Blue Lambo Black President for £20. Again, very generous. Thank you. Glad to see you back. I haven't watched this, but have added it to my list so I can come back to the stream. This is for the superb Tokugawa lecture. Looking forward to a Restoration Imperial Era stream when you get to it. Well, I'd like to, but as with all of these things, I have so many sort of tangential interests that and such a long sort of list of things to do that I'm not sure when I would sort of go over the Meiji Restoration era, the 1860s onwards in Japan. But thank you very much for enjoying that lecture. Again, I sort of see this as an addendum to the episode with Charlemagne and Marcus Furius Pertinax on the Fall of Eagles series, because, like I said, that series rather inexplicably leaves us with the Bosnian crisis and the dress rehearsal, then talks about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and then basically discusses the activation of the alliances in a throwaway line. It's thoroughly unsatisfactory, but so this series sort of completes the picture, but very much imperfectly, and very much as that series focuses so much on the Austrian and Russian and not the British perspective. But thank you. Uh, Judge Caligula Bushman, what's your opinion on Sean McKeegan's revisionist take that it's basically all Russia's fault? Are his discoveries in the Russian archives groundbreaking? No, I don't think that. I think it's pretty much what I've been stating all the time. I wouldn't say it's all Russia's fault, though. Like I said, you can't disentangle Russia from France, and you can't also um, say that Austria was not responsible for wanting a war with Serbia. I think the best way to, the way I've sort of tried to understand this is not to look at it as one party is guilty. I almost think that looking at the idea of war guilt is rather reductionist, but to try and oversimplify it, don't look at it as a single war, but look at it as almost three wars, which very much sort of accelerate and compound into the World War. So Austria is primarily responsible, not Germany. Germany facilitates it, obviously, but Austria, on her own volition, is primarily responsible for the war in Serbia. It should also be noted that the series actually does make brief mention of a compromise whereby Belgrade would be occupied, but there would be some sort of deal struck whereby they would march no further. In fact, once this the whole idea of prolonging these negotiations revolving around the specific nature of Serbia's destruction were actually very advantageous towards the Russians because it gave them more time to mobilize, and why Bettman Holvig was so indignant about the Austrian negotiations behind Germany's back, because like I said, Austria was looking at this as a localized conflict, but already the momentum of this has changed with the mobilization. Now we're talking about an existential conflict between Germany and Russia for the future of Europe. So in that case, I do believe that the partial mobilization, and again, this is at the beckoning principally of a figure that is completely omitted in this series. And I find it therefore fascinating that I believe the figure who is in many ways most responsible for the First World War is not mentioned in this series. And that is the figure of Sazonov, the Russian foreign secretary during this time. So just a thought to consider. But in terms of understanding Sean McMeekin's entire sort of historiography, that will have to sort of wait for another episode. 99 Iron Duke for $5 Australian. Thank you very much. Could I please recommend John Charmley's splendid Isolation, Britain, The Balance of Power, and the Origins of the First World War? Yes, you can absolutely recommend that. And I believe, Iron Duke, that correct me if I'm wrong, you have or haven't discussed that on your YouTube channel, focused mainly on British naval history, but also you have, I believe, a rather similar position to me regarding the futility of Britain's entry into the First World War. So yes, everyone check out Splendid Isolation by John Charmley, but also check out 99 Iron Duke's channel. And I will also say that I believe that Lord Salisbury was perhaps the last great prime minister we ever had, as wonderfully reactionary as that sounds. Okay, I'll just scroll down to see if we've got any more super chats. All right. 99 Duke for, again, $5 Australian. Thank you very much. Britain had totally won the naval dreadnought race against Germany by 1911, 1912. Well, I agree with you. I also believe that Germany could never win that race anyway. And I don't try to look at it as a fundamental race between who can build the largest dreadnought fleet. The Tirpitz plan and Kaiser Wilhelm's thinking was predicated on the idea that so long as the German fleet is a factor, so long as it only exists as a factor in the policy-making system of the European concert of power, the concert of European nations, the balance of power, then it has served its purpose, i.e., when we get involved in Agadir, the German naval presence will allow us to demand certain compensation, ultimately in Neue Cameroon. Ultimately, it wasn't as effective as planned, and I believe it was, in hindsight, a complete waste of time and money, because Germany had already gained her most significant colonial possessions in the scramble for Africa during the chancellorship of Otto von Bismarck. So the Kaiser's dreams of Weltpolitik were ultimately stymied because it did not precipitate the thing which he wanted the most, which was an alliance with Britain, joining the German and British naval forces. And again, the ironic thing is, had he been able to achieve an alliance with Britain, then all of a sudden German naval contention with Britain would have become a moot point. Right. Bolero 393 for $5 just sends a super sticker. So thank you very much, Bolero 393. That's very much appreciated. Right. And there's a final comment, not a super chat, but just a comment by R. Phillips Geekery. World War One can't be reduced to simplistic reasoning. A whole bunch of things came together to cause conflict, and I completely agree with you. I'm of the controversial opinion that World War One should not be taught to to students at school. I believe it's all this does is reinforce prejudices. Actually, I can extend that to a large scope of the teaching of history, unfortunately. Teaching as understood in schools, especially at the sort of GCSE level, is more an exercise in comprehension. Um, you know, it'll be useful for children to at least understand various historical facts, such as the kings and queens of England by rote. But of course, education is moving far beyond that and therefore becoming more contentious, and I would argue more useless, especially in the case of World War One. It should definitely not be taught to anyone, or unless you're sort of researching it yourself and you're finding all of these wonderful little sort of intricacies revolving around that, and the fact that this is still a moot point in terms of the historical consensus. There is still no definitive sort of view on the causes of World War One, and you can say it's one of the most sort of areas of frenetic intellectual activity in historiography as ever. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you, everyone who has sent a super chat, and good night.